The rain had been falling since dawn, relentless and gray, turning the narrow frontier road into a ribbon of slick, treacherous mud. Clara Reeves trudged forward, her boots sinking into the soft earth, water seeping through the thin leather. She clutched her suitcase so tightly that her knuckles whitened, afraid that if she let go even for a second, everything she owned would tumble into the muddy abyss. The journey had been long, weeks spent on rattling stagecoaches, nights in drafty inns where the sheets smelled of smoke and mildew, and days filled with the ache of loneliness. Each mile had been a small hope, a step toward a new life that had been promised to her in neatly folded letters and perfumed envelopes, a home, a husband, a family. Instead, she had stepped off the last stagecoach into silence, the man who had ordered her as a bride nowhere to be found. Her stomach twisted at the thought. She had left everything familiar behind, her small hometown, the streets where children played, the little library where she had spent countless afternoons reading about adventures in faraway lands. Everything had promised stability, a future she could finally call her own. And now she had nothing but a suitcase in her own two hands to carry her forward. The sky, dark and swollen with rain, pressed down on her like a weight she could not lift, and the wind cut through her thin coat, sharp and biting. In the distance, she saw a dim light flickering through the sheets of rain, a beacon almost too faint to believe. It was a farmhouse, small and hunched as if bowing under the weight of the storm. Clara's hope, fragile but insistent, pushed her onward. Each step was heavy, her soaked skirts clinging to her legs, boots squelching in the mud. As she neared the split rail fence surrounding the property, the rain began to ease, dripping from the trees in thick, slow beads. A single lantern glowed from the porch, swaying gently with the wind. The door creaked open, and a little girl appeared, stepping onto the porch barefoot, her blonde curls damp and sticking to her cheeks. She was tiny, no more than 7 or 8, with a dress that hung loosely and was clearly not warm enough for the cold morning. Her eyes, wide and wary, studied Clara with a seriousness that made the woman's chest tighten. "You lost?" the child asked, voice soft but direct, carrying the authority only a child who had learned the world's harshness too soon could possess. Clara swallowed, her throat tight with fatigue and the remnants of her fear. I think I am," she said, her voice trembling, both from the cold and from the helplessness that had clung to her since stepping off the stagecoach. The little girl's gaze lingered on her, sharp and assessing, as if measuring the worth of a stranger. Then, without another word, she stepped aside, gesturing to the open door. "You better come in. Papa says you don't leave folks in storms." Clara hesitated, the polite caution she had been forced to keep her entire life warring with the desperate longing for warmth, for safety, for human connection. Finally, she crossed the threshold. The warmth inside was immediate, a gentle embrace that seeped into her chilled bones. The small cabin smelled of wood smoke, cooked meals, and a faint trace of lavender soap. It was simple, humble, and yet it felt like the first real home she had glimpsed in months. Inside, everything bore the marks of a life lived with care and hardship: patched curtains, a small wooden table scuffed from years of use, a few rough-hewn chairs. The little girl perched on one of them, her bare feet swinging above the floor, and studied Clara with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "What's your name?" Clara asked, trying to pull her mind away from the storm. Outside and toward something grounding, something human. "Lydia," the girl answered after a brief pause. "Papa's fixing the fence. He'll be back soon." Clara nodded, a small smile forming despite the rain still dripping from her coat. There was a steadiness in Lydia's tone, an honesty that seemed both rare and reassuring. But then the girl tilted her head, her eyes locking onto Clara's with a clarity that made the woman's heart seize. "You look sad," Lydia said simply. "But that's okay." She pointed at Clara's suitcase. "You need a home." Clara blinked, startled, her chest constricted in a strange way. This little child, so small and vulnerable, had just spoken the truth of her deepest fear and desire aloud. She swallowed, unsure of what to say, when Lydia added in a tone that was impossibly earnest, "And I need a mommy." The words hit her like a lightning strike. She had thought she had seen all forms of loneliness, all shades of longing, but not this. Not a child so young, so fragile, yet so unwaveringly direct, articulating a need that was almost painful to hear. Clara's hands tightened around the suitcase, and for the first time, she felt a stirring of purpose beyond mere survival. Before she could respond, the door swung wide open with a loud creak, and heavy boots clomped across the floor. Lydia sprang up, her face lighting with excitement. "Papa, we got a visitor." Clara turned to see him, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, and with eyes that flickered from surprise to guarded suspicion. He studied her silently for a long moment, the kind of scrutiny that weighed a person down yet felt strangely protective. Elias Carter wasn't a man used to strangers. After losing his wife during childbirth, he had learned to carry the weight of the world alone, his only companion the small, fierce, and endlessly curious little girl who had become the center of his life. The cabin, modest and weathered, was a sanctuary he had built not just against the storm outside, but against the storm of his own grief and loneliness. So when Clara stepped in, dripping wet and looking like she had walked straight out of a nightmare, Elias froze, unsure how to respond. He shut the door behind him, the heavy wood thudding into the frame. Water dripped from his coat onto the floor, and he took a slow, measured breath before speaking. Caught in the storm, his voice was low, steady, and cautious, carefully neutral, like a man testing the waters before committing to kindness. Clara nodded, her hands still clutching her suitcase as if it were a lifeline. I'm sorry to intrude. I was left stranded, and I didn't know where else to go." Her words trembled, fragile but honest, carrying the exhaustion of a journey that had been both physically grueling and emotionally devastating. Lydia tugged at her father's sleeve, her small voice insistent, "Papa, she needs a home." Elias glanced down at his daughter, his jaw tightening just slightly. "Lydia," he began, a warning in his tone, but the little girl cut him off, undeterred. "And I need a mommy," she said, louder this time, the words tumbling out with the force of pure conviction. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She had been prepared for wary glances, for suspicion, for polite refusal, but this child, so young and so unabashed, had just laid bare a need that resonated deep within her. She looked at Elias, unsure whether to expect anger, amusement, or disbelief. Elias's eyes softened, and for a brief moment, Clara caught a flicker of vulnerability there, grief, caution, and longing all intertwined. He knelt to Lydia's level, resting a hand gently on her shoulder. "Lydia, we've talked about this," he said softly. "We don't pick mothers like we pick apples at the market." Lydia frowned, undeterred. "But she's nice," she said, pointing at Clara with a certainty that left no room for argument. Elias straightened, running a hand through his damp hair, his eyes meeting Clara's in a silent conversation. "She's had a hard day," he murmured, almost to himself. Then, louder, "You can stay the night. Tomorrow, I'll help you get to town if you wish. But tonight, you're welcome here." Clara felt a surge of relief, but it was mixed with the tender sting of longing. She nodded, her lips curving into a hesitant smile. Before she could thank him properly, Lydia had already grabbed her hand and tugged her toward the small kitchen table. "You're sitting next to me at supper." Clara laughed softly, her first genuine laugh in weeks, and followed the child. The cabin was humble. A simple stove, a few rough-hewn chairs, and a worn table that bore the scars of years. Yet in that simplicity, there was warmth, warmth from the fire, warmth from the presence of this little girl, warmth that began to thaw the icy fear clinging to Clara's chest. During supper, Lydia chattered incessantly, recounting stories of mischievous chickens, runaway goats, and imagined adventures in the woods. Clara listened, smiling and occasionally laughing, the laughter a balm she hadn't realized she so desperately needed. Elias watched quietly, stirring the stew and occasionally offering corrections to Lydia's wild exaggerations. There was a rhythm to the small household, a fragile harmony that had survived despite past pain and present struggles. When Lydia ran off to fetch a set of carved wooden toys, Elias finally spoke to Clara in the quiet the child had left behind. "She ain't usually that forward," he said, leaning against the counter. "She must, like you." Clara shook her head slightly. "I've seen myself in her," she admitted. "The part of me that wanted love, stability, someone to care, I see that in her." Elias's gaze softened, haunted by old memories. "She's had a hard start," he murmured. "Lost her mother before she even knew the sound of her voice." "I'm doing what I can, but," he trailed off, a shadow crossing his face. "You're doing more than you think," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible, yet carrying an assurance that surprised even her. Silence fell for a moment, thick but not uncomfortable. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving only the occasional drip of water from the eaves, but inside, a different kind of storm seemed to simmer, gentle and warm. Later, as Clara prepared for bed in the small guest room, the door creaked open softly. Tiny footsteps approached, and Lydia appeared, peeking around the doorframe with wide eyes. "Miss Clara," she asked, her voice small and hesitant. Yes, sweetheart, Clara replied, kneeling to meet her gaze. I don't want you to leave tomorrow, Lydia whispered, stepping fully into the room and wrapping her small arms around Clara's waist. Clara felt a lump in her throat. She bent down, holding the girl tightly, feeling the steady heartbeat against her own. I don't want to leave either, she admitted. Unseen, Elias lingered in the doorway, his broad shoulders framed by the dim light of the hallway. He watched silently, listening to the tender exchange, a mix of relief and something else flickering in his eyes, hope, perhaps, or the fragile possibility of healing. And in that quiet moment, Clara realized something profound. She was no longer just a stranger passing through. In the small hands clinging to her, in the trust and love that radiated from Lydia's innocent plea, she glimpsed a chance to rebuild, to belong, to be needed in a way she had never imagined possible. Her night in the cabin promised more than rest from the storm. It promised the first steps toward a life that could be filled with warmth, laughter, and, most of all, love. If you want, I can also expand part 3 to 700 words so the full story maintains the same depth and emotional richness. Morning light crept slowly over the horizon, spilling golden rays across the wet fields and glistening rooflines. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside fresh, washed clean, and alive with the sound of dripping leaves and birds shaking off the rain. Clara awoke to the faint smell of coffee and the soft hum of life stirring around her. For the first time in weeks, she felt rested, not just from sleep, but from the heavy, oppressive weight of uncertainty that had clung to her since the day she left home. She dressed quickly, pulling on her damp clothes from the previous night, now partially dried by the warmth of the fire. As she descended the narrow staircase of the cabin, she was met with a sight that brought an involuntary smile to her lips. Lydia barreling across the room, bare feet slapping against the worn wooden floor, laughter spilling from her lips in pure, unrestrained joy. You're still here, Lydia squealed, spinning in circles before throwing herself into Clara's legs. Clara bent down, scooping her into a tight hug. Wouldn't dream of leaving so soon, she whispered, her voice full of warmth. From the stove came a low chuckle. Elias, wiping his hands on a rough towel, looked up from stirring the morning coffee. His dark eyes, usually so guarded, held a softness that Clara hadn't seen the night before. Hope you slept well, he said, his voice gruff but carrying a hint of genuine curiosity. Better than I expected, Clara replied, allowing herself a small, shy smile. The simple exchange, ordinary as it seemed, carried the comfort of normalcy she hadn't known in months. Breakfast was a quiet, comforting affair. Lydia chattered endlessly, describing the misadventures of a chicken she had tried to tame and a goat that had escaped into the neighbor's yard. Clara laughed along, genuinely amused by the child's storytelling, while Elias offered gentle corrections or added small remarks that hinted at both affection and authority. The rhythm of the morning, the clatter of spoons, the smell of warm coffee, the laughter echoing off the wooden walls, was a melody Clara felt herself drawn into, a melody that reminded her what it felt like to belong somewhere. After breakfast, Clara stepped outside, the crisp air invigorating her. She inhaled deeply, letting the scent of wet earth, pine, and distant smoke fill her lungs. The land stretched wide and open, dotted with trees bending from the recent storm, a landscape both harsh and beautiful. She felt a small, fragile sense of peace settle inside her. For the first time in months, she wasn't wandering aimlessly. She had a place, however temporary, to call home. Elias joined her on the porch, hands resting in his pockets, eyes scanning the horizon as if he was measuring some invisible distance. I'll hitch the wagon soon, he said. Town's an hour away if you still want to go. Clara nodded, though her heart tightened at the thought of leaving this small sanctuary. She glanced back at the cabin, at the fire still smoldering in the hearth, at the table where Lydia had drawn with leftover chalk just yesterday. Leaving felt wrong, too abrupt, too hollow. Elias, reading her expression, hesitated. He studied her with a quiet intensity, the kind that made words unnecessary. Lydia's taken a shine to you, he finally said, breaking the silence. Clara's cheeks warmed. I've taken one to her as well, she admitted. Elias exhaled slowly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. I haven't had anyone here in a long time, he said softly. Don't know what you're planning next, but, if you need a place to stay longer. You're welcome, no obligations, no expectations. It wasn't a proposal, not in the sense of promises or declarations, but it was an opening, an offer of trust and acceptance she hadn't dared hope for. Clara's heart fluttered, the weight in her chest lightening just enough for her to breathe easier. Before she could respond, Lydia came bounding out of the cabin, her curls bouncing in the morning light. "Papa says you might stay," she exclaimed, spinning around Clara in a whirlwind of excitement. Clara laughed, lifting Lydia into her arms and spinning her gently. "Would you like that?" she asked, her voice full of tenderness. "Yes," Lydia squealed. "Then I can teach you how to braid my hair, tuck me in, read stories, and we can have adventures." Elias shook his head with a small, fond chuckle, gently intervening. "Lydia, let Miss Clara breathe." Clara didn't mind. She held Lydia tightly, feeling the warmth of the child and the pulse of life she radiated. And as she looked at Elias, standing quietly nearby, something unspoken passed between them, a mutual understanding, a fragile promise of shared futures and uncharted possibilities. Clara lowered Lydia back to the ground, brushing a strand of wet hair from her face. "If you'll have me," she said slowly, her heart heavy with both fear and hope, "I'd like to stay. At least for now," Lydia squealed, jumping into Clara's arms again, spinning with glee. Elias's relief was subtle but unmistakable, his shoulders relaxed, his stern features softening. A silent acknowledgement passed between the adults. They were entering something tentative and untested, but it was theirs to explore together. Life on the frontier would never be simple. There would be storms, challenges, and hardships, as there always were in such a rugged place. But standing on that porch, between the man who had opened his home and the child who had opened her heart, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose, of belonging, of roots forming in the soil of someone else's life. And when Lydia wrapped her arms around both of them, whispering, "Now I have a mommy," Clara felt a warmth settle inside her, a warmth that promised love, family, and a future she had once thought was lost forever. She wasn't just staying for shelter anymore. She was staying for them. She was staying for home. If you want, I can now compile all three expanded parts into one polished, cohesive story of over 2,100 words, fully ready to read as a single narrative. This would make it feel seamless and emotionally immersive. Do you want me to do that? Do you want me to do that next?